The Galactic Council had ruled the stars for centuries. A vast coalition of the most advanced species in the universe, they controlled trade, military alliances, and the very laws that governed interstellar civilization. Empires that refused to obey them crumbled under the weight of economic blockades, military interventions, or, if necessary, total annihilation. When humanity was discovered, the Council barely took notice. A small, insignificant race clinging to the edge of the Orion Arm, still struggling with the basics of interstellar travel. Their technology was primitive, their civilization fractured into competing nations. The Council had seen hundreds of species like them, proud, warlike, desperate to prove themselves. And in every case, the outcome was the same: they either submitted or perished. The first mistake the Council made was underestimating humans. The second mistake was assuming Earth's military followed the same rules as the rest of the galaxy. The war between humanity and the Council began over a simple dispute. A human colony on the frontier, Omega-3, had been established without proper authorization. According to the Council's laws, the system belonged to the Thalrex Dominion, a Council member species. The humans refused to abandon their colony, claiming they had settled there first. Diplomatic talks failed. The Council issued an ultimatum: evacuate within one planetary cycle or face military intervention. Earth's response was defiant. Come and take it. The Council's High Command barely discussed the matter. They deployed the 72nd Dominion Fleet, led by Supreme Commander Dareth Voltan, to Omega-3. This was no war, this was a minor disciplinary action. The fleet consisted of over 200 warships, carrying thousands of elite soldiers trained in planetary conquest. Against them, the humans had barely a dozen orbital platforms, outdated missile defenses, and a single warship, a clunky, outdated destroyer that was more rust than metal. The invasion took less than a week. The orbital defenses were wiped out in hours. The human warship put up a pathetic resistance before being reduced to molten slag. The ground forces fared no better. They fought fiercely, but the outcome was inevitable. The Council's forces overwhelmed them with superior numbers, firepower, and technology. Within days, the Council had complete control of Omega-3. Earth had lost. Or so they thought. The occupation begins. After the battle, the Council set up a military occupation on Omega-3. Standard procedure. They installed a planetary governor, enforced curfews, and disarmed any remaining human forces. Prisoners of war were sent to high-security detention centers. What they didn't expect was the resistance. At first, it was minor: supply convoys going missing, patrols vanishing in the night. The Council assumed it was nothing more than the remnants of the human military trying to fight back. Annoying, but not a real threat. Then the execution started. Council officers were found dead in their barracks, throats slit. Their bodies were left on display, hanging from streetlights with messages carved into their flesh. This is just the beginning. Entire squads were lured into ambushes, their bodies found mutilated beyond recognition. Explosive traps targeted high-ranking officials. The governor's palace was bombed, reducing half the building to rubble. The Council's elite forces, battle-hardened, trained for planetary suppression, were rattled. They had fought insurgencies before, but nothing like this. The humans didn't fight for territory or strategic objectives. They fought for vengeance. They fought to inflict terror. Within a month, Omega-3 was a death trap. Council troops refused to patrol certain districts. Commanders begged for reinforcements. The streets ran red with blood. And then, intelligence reports began to surface. The resistance fighters weren't soldiers. They weren't remnants of Earth's military. They were something else. The truth uncovered. The Council's intelligence officers began analyzing the patterns of attack. The brutality. The complete disregard for civilian casualties. The psychological warfare. It didn't match standard human military tactics. Something was wrong. The breakthrough came when an intercepted human transmission was decoded. It wasn't a standard military signal. It was encrypted with protocols that didn't match any known human military database. The message was simple. We are free. At first, the meaning wasn't clear. But after digging into classified Earth records, the truth came out. The resistance fighters on Omega-3 weren't part of Earth's military. They were war criminals. The worst of the worst. Humans so dangerous that their own governments had locked them away. Men and women guilty of unspeakable crimes, massacres, torture, biological warfare. Individuals whose names were buried under classified files, deemed too dangerous to be executed, too unstable to be used. Earth had lost the war. Their government had surrendered. Their military had stood down. But in doing so, they had unleashed the monsters they had once locked away. The prisons that held these individuals had been emptied. The black site detention facilities had been abandoned. And the war criminals had only one directive: kill them all. The war takes a dark turn. The Council was no stranger to war. They had fought countless species, crushed entire civilizations. But nothing had prepared them for what came next. The resistance intensified. Not with guerrilla tactics. Not with insurgent strikes. With pure, unfiltered horror. Council soldiers were no longer just killed. They were hunted. A garrison of 200 troops went missing overnight. When reinforcements arrived, they found the remains, dismembered, displayed like trophies. Some were still alive, barely, their bodies wired into their own armor, kept conscious as their suits pumped stimulants into their bloodstream. One soldier was found in a council barracks, standing at attention in full uniform. His fellow soldiers at first thought he had simply fallen asleep on duty. Then they saw the jagged smile carved into his throat, his lifeless eyes staring ahead. Entire convoys were lured into fake distress calls, only to be ambushed. Ships were hijacked from the inside, their crews slaughtered. Communication lines were hijacked, broadcasting the screams of captured officers back to their own fleets. And then, the messages began. We were locked away for a reason. We have nothing to lose. This is what you wanted, isn't it? The Council realized, too late, that this was no longer a war. This was a nightmare. And it was only the beginning. The Galactic Council still refused to believe they had lost control. Their fleets remained stationed over Omega-3, massive warships bristling with firepower, ready to reduce the planet to ashes if necessary. Their generals assured the High Command that the human resistance was nothing more than a temporary nuisance. They were wrong. The occupation force had been 50,000 strong at the start. Now, barely 30,000 remained. Entire battalions had vanished, their remains later found in mass graves, their bodies stripped of weapons, armor, and identification. The commanders reported that discipline among their troops was collapsing. Soldiers refused to leave their bases, fearing the ghosts that stalked the cities. Patrols were sent out in squads of 20, then 30, then not at all. The once mighty Galactic Council now held only the land directly beneath their warships. Everywhere else belonged to the monsters they had unleashed. The first retaliation. The Council had fought guerrilla wars before. Their elite forces were trained in counterinsurgency, urban combat, and planetary suppression. The typical response to rebellion was overwhelming force. They executed thousands of captured civilians, hoping to break the resistance's morale. It didn't work. Instead, the resistance stopped taking prisoners. Captured Council soldiers were no longer sent back in body bags. They were sent back alive, but broken, missing eyes, ears, fingers. Some had been forced to watch their own executions on loop, their minds shattered beyond repair. Others had been infected with viruses that killed them slowly and painfully while their comrades listened helplessly. The message was clear: you kill one of us, we make sure 100 of you suffer. One such incident shook the entire occupation force to its core. A high-ranking council officer, Colonel Vastolek, had been captured when his convoy was ambushed. The council thought him dead, until he appeared on a hacked council broadcast. He was still in uniform, his medals polished, his posture straight. But his eyes were empty. Behind him stood a masked figure, clad in dark, mismatched armor, blood-stained and covered in human military insignias that had long been outlawed. The masked figure didn't speak. They didn't need to. Vastolek spoke instead, his voice eerily calm, reciting the names of every soldier under his command. The list went on for nearly 30 minutes. Then he looked directly into the camera and spoke his last words. They are all dead. You are next. The screen went black. The Council's generals dismissed it as propaganda. The soldiers on Omega-3 knew better. Vastolek had been the one who ordered the civilian executions. His captors made sure everyone knew his face before they ended him. A new kind of war. The Council shifted tactics. They deployed mechanized war machines, hunter-killer drones, synthetic enforcers, and aerial bombardment squadrons. They planned to erase the insurgents, leaving no survivors. It didn't matter. The war criminals adapted. They reprogrammed the drones, using them to assassinate their former masters. They lured entire squadrons into traps, using civilians as bait, then slaughtered them mercilessly. In one horrifying event, a full platoon of council soldiers entered a seemingly abandoned city block. When they reached the center, they found a pile of human bodies, their limbs arranged in the shape of the council's insignia. Then the snipers started firing. One by one, the soldiers fell. They tried to retreat, but the streets were already sealed. Explosives hidden in the walls collapsed the buildings around them, burying them alive. Those who survived were picked off one by masked figures who moved through the rubble like ghosts. It wasn't war. It was extermination. The butchers unmasked. The council needed answers. They had always assumed humans were a civilized race, bound by the same moral codes as the rest of the galaxy. But who were these killers? A captured human transmission provided the answer. The intercepted data logs contained names. The first belonged to Sergeant Callan Voss. He had once been a decorated soldier in Earth's military, renowned for his tactical genius, until he butchered an entire colony of enemy civilians in a past war. He had been sentenced to life in a black site prison, erased from official records. Now, he was leading the resistance on Omega-3. The second name, Elena Graves. Once a top operative in Earth's intelligence division, she had personally overseen the torture and execution of high-profile war criminals. She had gone too far, even by human standards. Her existence had been classified as terminated. She wasn't terminated. She was here. And she wasn't alone. The logs contained dozens of names, each one worse than the last. These weren't soldiers. They were the monsters that humanity itself had buried. And now they were free. The Council's breaking point. Panic spread through the ranks of the Council's occupation forces. Morale plummeted. Some soldiers outright refused to leave their bases. Others turned their weapons on themselves, choosing death over whatever fate awaited them in the hands of the resistance. Entire platoons abandoned their posts, defecting to neutral space. Others tried to surrender, only to be slaughtered where they stood. One infamous recording captured the final words of a council officer moments before his base was overrun. His transmission, meant for the fleet's high command, was intercepted and broadcasted across every occupied world. They're not human. They're demons. They don't fight for freedom. They fight for blood. I can hear them in the vents. I can smell the bodies. Please, please, tell my family I tried to. The transmission cut off. The final message. With their occupation force collapsing, the council faced a choice, reinforce or retreat. But it was already too late. The war criminals had spread beyond Omega-3. Other occupied planets began to fall. The council's war had turned into a galactic uprising. And at the center of it all stood the monsters that humanity had once feared. They had no allegiance. No home. No rules. They had been forgotten. Now, they would be remembered. And the galaxy would never be the same. The Galactic Council had spent centuries refining the art of war. They crushed insurrections with swift precision. They broke planetary economies through blockades. Their rule was absolute, backed by fleets so vast they blotted out the stars. And yet, for all their power, they had never faced an enemy like this. The war criminals of humanity were not rebels. They were not freedom fighters. They were something far worse. They did not want liberation. They wanted vengeance. And now, with Omega-3 all but lost, their war was just beginning. The fall of the Black Fortress. The Black Fortress was the Council's last stronghold on Omega-3, a massive citadel of steel and plasma shielding, home to the planet's Supreme Overseer, High Marshal Orzhal. It was the safest place on the entire planet. Surrounded by 20-meter walls, automated turrets, and over 10,000 of the Council's best troops, it was a fortress meant to withstand sieges for years. It fell in one night. The attack began with absolute silence. The guards on the walls vanished without a sound. When the Council commanders finally noticed, it was too late. Explosives ripped through the fortress's power grid, plunging the stronghold into darkness. Then came the monsters. They moved like shadows, slipping through the defenses, ripping soldiers apart in the pitch blackness. Entire squads vanished as they were dragged into the vents, their screams echoing through the halls. Desperate, the Council's officers ordered the turrets to fire indiscriminately, but the war criminals had already hacked the defenses. The turrets turned on their own troops, cutting down hundreds before self-destructing in a fireball of plasma. Then, over the fortress's loudspeakers, a voice rang out. A single sentence. You locked us away, but now we're free. The slaughter continued for hours. The defenders, trapped in their own fortress, fought until they were overwhelmed by a force that did not fear death, because they had already lived through hell. By sunrise, the Black Fortress belonged to the war criminals. High Marshal Orzhal was found crucified at the gates, his body flayed open, his rank insignia embedded in his chest. And Omega-3 was now fully in human hands. The war spreads beyond Omega-3. With the planet lost, the Council ordered a retreat. Fleet Admiral Zyros, in command of the warships above the planet, prepared for orbital bombardment. If they couldn't hold Omega-3, they would turn it into ashes. But before he could give the order, an alert appeared on his command deck. A distress signal. Not from Omega-3, but from 3 other occupied human colonies. They were under attack. The war criminals had already moved on. And they weren't just fighting anymore. They were winning. On the colony of Delta Prime, entire regiments of Council forces were found slaughtered in their barracks, their bodies lined up in neat rows, stripped of their armor. On Araxis 4, a Council command ship was hijacked mid-flight. Its entire bridge crew was found gutted, their eyes removed and left on their control panels. The ship crashed into the planet's capital city, igniting a planetary revolution. On Varkis 12, the Council's main supply depot for the entire sector was destroyed in a single night. Every guard massacred. Every shipment of weapons stolen. The Council had spent years conquering these worlds. The war criminals were taking them back in days. The failed response. With panic spreading, the Council convened an emergency war summit. Their response was immediate: deploy reinforcements, enforce martial law, and begin mass executions. But none of it mattered. The war criminals had already anticipated every move. The reinforcements never arrived, because their transports were hijacked in mid-warp, the crews slaughtered before they reached their destinations. The martial law edicts only fueled the growing planetary uprisings. Civilian populations, inspired by the war criminals' brutal tactics, began turning on their Council oppressors. And as for the mass executions? The war criminals had their own response. For every human killed, they executed an entire Council battalion. One by one, the occupied human worlds fell. The legends begin. As the war spread, the legends of the war criminals grew. The galaxy whispered their names in fear. Sergeant Callan Voss, the ghost of Omega-3, who had personally wiped out entire battalions with his sniper rifle, leaving messages written in blood on their corpses. Elena Graves, the butcher of Araxis, who had executed every single Council governor on her planet in a single night, leaving their heads on the steps of the Capitol Palace. Rogan the Red Hail, an ex-commander from Earth's most feared Black Ops kill teams, who hunted Council officers one by one, leaving their severed hands as trophies. They were not fighting for humanity. They were not fighting for Earth. They were fighting for themselves. And the galaxy was drowning in their wrath. The Council's desperation. With defeat looming, the Council turned to their last resort. They activated Project Eclipse. A force so secret, so horrifying, that it had only been used once before in the history of the Galactic Council. A legion of bioenhanced super soldiers, genetically engineered and cybernetically modified to be the perfect hunters. They were deployed in silence. No transmissions. No warnings. Their mission was simple. Find the war criminals. Eliminate them all. But the Council had made one final mistake. They had created the perfect predators. But the war criminals were not prey. They were the real monsters. And the hunt was about to begin. The Galactic Council had been pushed to the edge of oblivion. World after world had fallen to the war criminals. Their fleets were in disarray, their commanders too terrified to issue orders, and their soldiers too afraid to fight. But the Council had one final weapon. A force engineered in secret. A force bred not for war, but for extermination. Project Eclipse. The most ruthless, genetically perfected super soldiers ever created, programmed to hunt and kill anything that moved. They had been activated with one mission. Kill every last human war criminal. But as the Council would soon learn, the hunt works both ways. The first contact, Eclipse versus the war criminals. The Eclipse unit struck without warning. On Delta Prime, an Eclipse kill squad dropped into a war criminal stronghold in the dead of night. The fortress had stood for weeks, untouchable, fortified with traps and ambushes. But the Eclipse didn't trigger a single alarm. The defenders barely had time to react. Infrared sensors failed to detect them. Motion scanners registered nothing. The war criminals only knew something was wrong when their men started vanishing. Silent blades slit throats before a single shot could be fired. Plasma rifles incinerated bodies before the alarms could be sounded. The first 30 defenders died before they even saw their attackers. By dawn, the fortress was silent. The Council received a single message from the Eclipse strike leader. Objective eliminated. Commencing next operation. For the first time, the war criminals were on the defensive. The response, a monster fights back. The war criminals had spent years mastering the art of slaughter. But they had never fought anything like the Eclipse. Normal soldiers screamed when caught in an ambush. The Eclipse fought without fear. Normal soldiers bled. The Eclipse's bodies were reinforced with synthetic armor plating. Normal soldiers hesitated. The Eclipse never stopped, never questioned, never retreated. It was a perfect killing machine. For the first time, the war criminals lost ground. For the first time, they ran. But war criminals don't just run. They adapt. And Sergeant Callan Voss, the ghost of Omega-3, was the first to crack the Eclipse's code. The counterattack, turning predators into prey. Voss had fought elite killers before. He was one. His response to the Eclipse wasn't to fight them head-on. That was suicide. Instead, he made them doubt themselves. He lured them into traps that didn't rely on sensors or weapons. Instead, he used psychological warfare. The first trap was set on Varkey's 12. An Eclipse squad breached an abandoned complex, tracking what they believed to be a high-value war criminal. Their HUDs showed clear life signatures. They found corpses. Not humans. Eclipse soldiers. Their own men, skinned and positioned in the exact same formation the team was currently standing in. Then the lights cut out. A voice echoed through their comms. "You think you know how to hunt?" Then the Eclipse started dying. One by one. No energy weapons. No plasma rounds. Knives. Ropes. Blunt trauma. By dawn, the hunters had become the hunted. The psychological war. What followed was pure hell. The war criminals hacked into the Eclipse's neural systems. They fed them false sensory inputs, making them see enemies where there were none. Entire Eclipse squads turned on each other. One Eclipse strike team on Araxis, 4 executed their own commander, believing him to be an infiltrator. On Delta Prime, an Eclipse unit sealed itself inside a bunker, believing they were under attack, only for the war criminals to flood the ventilation system with poison gas. The perfect soldiers were breaking. And once the Eclipse started hesitating, the war criminals finished them. The apex predators unleashed. Elena Graves, the butcher of Araxis, escalated the war further. She had studied the Eclipse's battle algorithms. Their patterns of attack. Their weaknesses. She developed a new doctrine. It was called Shadow Doctrine. Step 1. Deny them information. Eclipse relied on perfect intelligence. The war criminals erased themselves from every network, burned every record, and wiped every trace of their existence. Step 2. Make them doubt. The war criminals left Eclipse helmets filled with blood, placed carefully in their patrol routes. They broadcast screams of fallen Eclipse soldiers over encrypted comms, making them question if they were even real. Step 3. Bleed them. Eclipse squads were lured into tight quarters where their enhancements meant nothing. The war criminals used poison, fire, and gas, attacks the Eclipse's cybernetics couldn't counter. And finally, Step 4. Erase them. On the occupied planet of Gravik 6, an Eclipse strike force of 200 was sent to hunt a high-priority war criminal target. They never reported back. When the Council sent drones to investigate, they found a single transmission loop. It was the sound of Eclipse soldiers screaming. And at the very end, a single voice whispered, "We are worse than you." The final Eclipse offensive. The Eclipse were losing. What had begun as a flawless extermination mission had turned into a nightmare. The war criminals had turned their own tactics against them. The Council ordered one last strike. The entire Eclipse force, the last of them, was deployed onto a single battlefield. One last chance to wipe out the war criminals. But when they landed, no one was there. Just silence. Then, the war criminals attacked from every direction. It was not a battle. It was a massacre. The Eclipse fought to the last man, but they were no longer invincible. By dawn, the war criminals stood victorious. And Project Eclipse was no more. The aftermath, the war criminals take control. With the Eclipse gone, the last line of defense was broken. The war criminals now controlled entire sectors. They weren't just insurgents anymore. They were warlords. Humanity had abandoned them. The Council had tried to erase them. Now, they would burn the entire galaxy for what was done to them. The war was no longer about survival. It was about revenge. And no one would be safe. The Galactic Council had ruled for thousands of years. Empires had risen and fallen beneath them. Countless species had been crushed under their banner. Their power was absolute, their reach infinite. And now, in a matter of months, they were being hunted to extinction. The war criminals of Earth were no longer an uprising. They were no longer an insurgency. They were an empire of vengeance. They had no homeworld. No laws. No mercy. Only one rule remained. No survivors. The Galactic Council's final stand. With the eclipse wiped out and their armies shattered, the last remaining members of the Galactic Council fled to the fortress world of Xiphos Prime. The planet was a fortified stronghold, its entire surface a labyrinth of bunkers, planetary shields, and orbital defense stations. It was the most heavily defended planet in the known galaxy. It had never fallen. The war criminals didn't care. They were not an army. They were death incarnate. And they had come to end the war. The assault begins. The war criminals had no fleet, no capital ships, no planetary siege weapons. Yet Xiphos Prime's defenses meant nothing. Because the war criminals were already on the planet. They had infiltrated the Council's highest command levels, posing as fleeing mercenaries and defectors. They had been inside the fortress for weeks. And when the attack began, the shields never activated. The turrets never fired. Because the war criminals had already sabotaged everything. The first explosions rocked the capital as entire bunkers collapsed from within. The Council's elite bodyguards turned on each other, their neural implants hacked by war criminal technicians. By the time the Planetary Defense Force realized what was happening, it was too late. Xiphos Prime was already lost. The massacre of Xiphos Prime. The Galactic Council made one final broadcast before their fall. It was a desperate plea for aid. A warning to the rest of the galaxy. But as the message aired, the councillors realized something terrifying. They were not alone in their chamber. The war criminals were already inside. The broadcast continued live as councillors were dragged screaming from their seats. The cameras captured every moment. The Butcher of Araxis, Elena Graves, took a councillor's head in her hands and slowly, methodically snapped his neck on air. Sergeant Callan Voss, the ghost of Omega-3, smiled as he drove a knife through a Supreme Chancellor's skull. The last thing the galaxy saw before the broadcast cut to black was a single phrase carved into the walls behind the slaughtered leaders. No mercy for the merciless. The Galactic Council was no more. The galaxy burns. With the Council dead, the war criminals did not stop. They had no interest in ruling. They wanted retribution. And they would burn the entire galaxy to satisfy their wrath. Planetary governors were dragged from their palaces and executed in the streets. Entire species that had aided the Council were exterminated. Council-allied military forces were hunted down one by one, their fleets left adrift, their soldiers slaughtered to the last. On Avarice 9, the war criminals bombed every spaceport, leaving the entire population stranded to starve. On Narek 4, they infected the water supply with a genetically engineered virus that dissolved flesh on contact. On Orvax 7, they forced every surviving council general to fight to the death in a blood-soaked arena, broadcast live to every world in the sector. The war criminals had not just won. They had eradicated their enemies. The last refugees. The war criminals had one final target. The last remnants of the Galactic Council had fled to a distant, hidden system known only as Epsilon Sanctuary. A secret world, known only to the highest-ranking members of the Council. A last resort in case of total galactic collapse. It was meant to be a safe haven. A world untouched by war. But the war criminals found it. And they came with fire. When their fleet arrived, they did not demand surrender. They did not offer terms. They simply bombarded the planet for 72 hours straight. The oceans boiled away. The cities became craters of molten glass. The screams of the last survivors were lost in the firestorm. When the war criminals finally left Epsilon Sanctuary, they did not look back. Because there was nothing left. The new order of monsters. With the war over, the galaxy lay in ruins. And the war criminals vanished. No one knew where they went. Some believed they had turned on each other, consumed by their own violence. Others whispered that they had returned to Earth, though no ships were ever seen heading in that direction. But the fear remained. Every world, every species, every civilization that had once served the Galactic Council lived in terror of their return. Because the war criminals had left a message behind. Carved into the ruins of Xiphos Prime, burned into the surface of Epsilon Sanctuary, broadcast on every galactic frequency once a cycle. A single phrase. We are watching. And the galaxy never forgot. Because in the darkness, the monsters of Earth still waited. And they would return when the stars bled once more.